Everybody. Thanks for coming today. Welcome to our executive briefing, our cybersecurity guide for engineering and manufacturing. My name's Lee Hodgson. I'm a senior technology strategist with Rodin, and I'm very excited to have our own CIO here at Rodin, Brendan Welch, with us today. Look, today we're going to share with you some relevant insights to in the hope of helping you guys to be more informed around what's actually going on in the cybersecurity space that's really relevant to Australian engineering and manufacturing businesses. We're also going to share some actionable steps that you can apply immediately to be more effective in managing risk in your business. And we have a bit of time at the end for a bit of Q&A as well. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A and we'll do our best to get to them. So look, let's jump right in. For us, we're on the front line and we see cybercrime, come across it a fair bit, and it affects people from all walks of life. But it's definitely hitting small businesses the hardest at the moment. While those attacks on large businesses and government agencies, they're kind of the ones that get the majority of the news coverage. We see smaller businesses in general that are more vulnerable to cyber criminals and definitely suffering more proportionately from the risk of cyber attack. While it might be true that smaller businesses might be directly targeted and in the same way that, say, an Optus or a Medibank might be, I guess attackers in this space tend to be casting a broader net, so it's more opportunistic. And you guys also have to contend with that. Typically in the small business space, that lack of experienced cybersecurity operations staff. It's difficult to find funds to invest in cybersecurity and generally smaller IT budgets overall, I guess. And these are all contributing factors to this level of vulnerability. You might be asking yourself, well, why would I be a target for a cyber attack? I probably don't hold much sensitive information or personally identifiable information, although many of you do have your own IP that is value and could potentially be held for ransom. We do often out in this industry have a lot of a larger IT infrastructure footprint, particularly on premise, and things like your operational technology, SCADA machinery, those sorts of things that can often be easily exploited, particularly if they're accessible from the internet in a way that's maybe not secure or misconfigured, which I guess is contributing to us being a little bit easier target and perhaps a bit of low-hanging fruit in a way. So I do want to take a moment to reflect on the reality of the threat landscape in engineering manufacturing in Australia. So last year, 2024, was a particularly challenging year for the sector. To be honest, it's seen a rather shocking amount of your peers fall victim to cyber attacks. And no one's safe. Even our meat pie makers here as well, which is well, it's just un-Australian if you ask me. But I guess one of the reasons why we're seeing this uptick in attacks is because of the rise of ransomware groups. These guys are organised crime groups that they carry out sort of targeted attacks and operate ransomware as a service tools that affiliates can also purchase to carry out their own attacks. So you might see a few common names listed in some of these examples on your screen here. Things like sarcoma and ransomware. There's many others as well. So they're quite well organized criminal networks that are, often collaborate between each other to specifically target, certain sectors and businesses for financial gain. Many of the names are listed here on the screen, and that's just a small sample of some of the ones that we've come across last year. They sort of found out about this or came to light when these ransomware groups post on their dark websites, and they'll often be threatening to leak or sell data that they've stolen, if a ransom's not paid. So, I guess that evolution of ransomware is not just the operational disruption that's caused by encrypting your systems and that lost production time or maybe missed orders that can impact us. We also need to think about on the other side, that what happens if they're holding our data for ransom and other impacts that could have. And the other part of it is that they'll often, Brendan's going to go into this a little bit deeper, but in terms of how they orchestrate these attacks, but they often are orchestrated over many days or even weeks too, which is, it really highlights why it's essential that you have capabilities in place to actually detect and respond if there has been a breach before it gets to that point. I will talk a little bit more about that in a bit, I guess the things that you should be doing. But I'm going to hand over to Brendan now. He's going to give a bit deeper sort of insight into some of the common threats that we're seeing, and give you a bit of insight into how bad actors are getting past your multi-factor authentication, your firewalls, and also maybe delve into some of the sort of known and possibly unknown costs of a cyber incident.
Awesome. Thanks, Lee. Yeah. So as you mentioned, I'm going to take a little bit of a sidestep and run you through probably three different examples of how I suppose some malware can get in, how business email compromise works, and what a pass the cookie attack is. So if you don't know what those are, don't worry, I'll go into them in a little bit. But effectively, yeah, I probably to start here. So ransomware is still kind of one of the top threats for small business, and I'd probably classify that around the 500 employee mark. And kind of why might that be? It's still really highly profitable. Small businesses will put in, I suppose, what they can for a security, but I suppose with the advance of AI and all those kinds of things, it's a lot easier for a threat actor to kind of go through and attack your system and kind of bypass those securities. And that's kind of the limited resources that we have for those defenses and things like that. They kind of don't really care about your downtime, but also kind of look at that and go, that's something that we can use to leverage and get either a payment out of you or cause just kind of general harm to an organization. Like I said, the AI side really is getting, I'd say, incredibly sophisticated from that side, where it's really indistinguishable to kind of figure out what is a legitimate email and what is a hacking email. They're getting really good at kind of mirroring a lot of those. And then obviously with the data that you hold, while it might not be a financial, like a financial planner or something like that, you still have a lot of personally identifiable information, and kind of being in the manufacturing space as well. You are in that supply chain, so there is quite a lucrative spot for an attacker to get in and kind of either change bank details or change where orders go and things like that. So there's definitely a presence in there and a target that's in that industry. So I guess some common attack entry points, which is the next slide for you, Lee. Yeah, some common attack entry points. So I guess the engineering and manufacturing industry has quite a lot of what I would say legacy design principles in the softwares that are used in it. And that's not anything that kind of you can do. It's just the way that the softwares are that we need to use and kind of some of the technical requirements of them. So coming with those, there's probably a lot more of what I would consider a legacy attack entry point. So you might see things like remote desktop protocols being used for access, whether that's inside the network. So you need to remote into a PC to control something, or you're remoting in from an external point outside of the business where those devices sit. So that's something that's commonly used, and there's a lot of exploits that can be used against the remote desktop protocol. You might be using a VPN, and a lot of places still do. There's been fair growth in the way that those connections are secured. So whether that has or hasn't been looked at in the last kind of little while, definitely having a look at how you're connecting into your environment when you're off away from the office or away from site is definitely something to look at. You've got, I suppose, phishing attacks that come through. That's a kind of stock standard, not industry specific or anything like that. And like I said, the AI definitely helps with getting people to click on those links. Insecure Internet of Things, or IoT, or SCADA devices become a gateway for a breach in a poorly designed network. So you might find that there's devices out there, it has an old firmware on it, it has a vulnerability that can be used to kind of get into your network and become a little spot that a adversary can hide and kind of run their attacks from. And then kind of like I said, you've got the legacy softwares that come through that may not be getting patched, that has a higher increase of vulnerabilities, or you don't have the vendor support to kind of get those updates. So there are definitely some common entries that come in. So yeah, next, I guess I wanted to run you through how a malware attack generally or typically takes place. And these can stretch on for a fair period of time. You may have someone in your system without knowing, and kind of they've collected all this information, and then 2 months later, maybe, depends, they might hit go and you'll kind of end at the end point where you're getting extorted for money. So I'll run through. So Your first phase is the infection phase, and that's kind of your common way of getting infected is by a user clicking on an attachment in an email or kind of falling for a phishing attempt. And that's what leads to the initial part of the malware being installed. Once you've done that, you've got the command and control side, which is where your installed malware starts to talk back to a control server and starts getting instructions around what it needs to do. Um, and the reason that it does that is if it's got that in there when you first install it, it's more likely to be picked up by an antivirus. So they build all of these platforms to really try and stay hidden from any platforms that you might have in place at the moment that would protect you against it. So once you've called back to the command and control and it's got some additional information, it might download some extra malware because it can do that, or it might download some legitimate tools that can be used in the next stages to kind of do what that is, which is lateral discovery and movement around the network. So kind of once the malware's in the system, it has its control channel back to the command center. It's going to start looking through your network. It's going to look for what else can be attacked and kind of what vulnerabilities are out there in firmware or softwares that you might be using, and can do things like a brute force attempt. It might use even probably or it could use credentials that have been purchased on the dark web. So that's one of those things. If you get alerts like your accounts have been breached, that's why it's really important to change your passwords. May even use things like old users that have left the organization. They may have active accounts. Definitely want to make sure that they're closed off. But yeah, using say like a legitimate tool like a network scanner to find devices that are on the network, again, is really trying to mask that nefarious action that they're trying to do with a legitimate tool that would look like something that you would see from a network administrator if you were kind of coming from the antivirus perspective. So once they know what they can attack and they know what vulnerabilities are in your network, that's kind of when we jump into the next phase around the malicious theft and file encryption. So that would be the part where a channel's opened up from a compromised system to enable data transfer out. And so they're doing that data exfiltration. They're going to kind of use, I would say, a standard filter. So like different file types, maybe Word docs, Excels, drawings, things like that, certain sizes and some common locations. So they're not going to, well, depending on what the attack might be, they may specifically look for something like a passwords dot spreadsheet, which I highly recommend against. If you have one of those, talk to us about a password manager because I never wish to see another one of those again, but I'm sure I will. But yeah, so they'll look for different types of files that they can then pull out of the organization. And as they're doing that, they're generally encrypting those files in their path. So you basically get to the point where you've then got the extortion side. So they've been through, they've pulled out all the data they want, they've locked up your files, and now's the time for money. So they'll either reach out and leave as I suppose, instructions in a place that you'll be able to see it on how to either decrypt your files, pay the attacker, kind of give them what they want. And there's a couple of different types. It could be a funds to decrypt your files. They may be holding you to ransom to kind of go and do something that might have found some incriminating evidence on your systems and use that as a kind of leverage to get you to go and do what you need to do. But generally, it's a Bitcoin payment or something like that that you then have to go and go through. So that's I suppose the common malware attack. But you might say like, all right, how does that get in? What are those kinds of things? So the next one that I wanted to run through is a business email compromise. So basically, this is another process of trying to get someone to click on a link and go through and do something, but doing it from a trusted location, I guess. So the start might be is you take your email, you change the address, and you kind of make it appear that it's coming from someone. So that might not be the legitimate part. And someone will click on it and they'll do something. They might enter in their details. But effectively, what they're trying to do is gain some kind of authoritative presence to the person that they're emailing. So that's where you kind of your fish kind of comes in there. I suppose and that's the bit click. So you get the response back. You might get someone to enter in their credentials. They then have their account compromised, and the person can then send, I suppose, legitimate emails as that compromised user, which then can kind of go further and start kind of either getting people to download things, again, leading to the malware prior, or even just kind of updating details in bank records or kind of starting the process of excuse me, the next process, which is a pass the cookie attack. So this one here, the way that this works is similar to the email phishing. So you might get an email, you might click something that takes you to your banking website or to a vendor portal or somewhere like that. Um, and you will enter in, again, kind of comes back to that AI. The site may look identical to the site that you're used to logging into, but it's actually sending all of your data off somewhere and sitting in the middle. So what happens with that is you enter in your details, you go through, it's acting as that intermediary. It will then log you in to that website and has a cookie, not the thing that you eat, but a little bit of data that gets stored on your computer. And that identifies you to the server as an active session. So you've kind of proved your identity and can go through and do what you need to do. Once that's happened, this kind of attack will copy that cookie and then the kind of threat actors will use it in however they are going to do it. Um, but it effectively gives them access into your other platforms. So this is basically a way to bypass multi-factor authentication. So for things like logging into a banking portal or logging in somewhere where you have financial information that you might want to update some details and things like that, that's how you can kind of get into that. So with saying that, if you are going to do banking detail updates to your suppliers or kind of to your clients, that's where I always say that the multi-factor for that kind of situation is never enough. It's always you want to positively verify changes that come through, say like a change to account details or things like that. So yeah, there I suppose three kind of attacks that come through. But then once you've been attacked, I guess the next kind of things that comes up is what's the cost of a cyber incident? So the you might have a few things that initially come to mind, like it's your kind of downtime or financial impact, but there's definitely a few other things that need to come through and kind of come into that place. So yeah, like I said, the known versus hidden, your immediate costs can be your incident response and your impacts to revenue, and especially if it's unplanned for. You've got additional costs following the data breach, including kind of retrieving intellectual property or making up for the operational disruption that comes through to a business, possibly paying the ransomware if that's what you choose to do, and then kind of providing compensation to impacted customers or partners. Um, and then I suppose the secondary challenge of the cost is that kind of once you've been breached, likelihood of being breached again is much higher. So there was a recent study that said around 80% of ransomware attack victims will then be a repeat victim. So that kind of single payout or something like that might be quite costly if it comes through multiple times. Um, I guess then you've got reputational damage. So it's kind of, we're looking a little bit lower into there. So there's about, well, that study kind of came through and said 41% of chief information security officers and C-suite executives named reputational damage being one of the biggest costs to their businesses while following the cyber attack. So yeah, you've got that. You've got kind of losing future business prospects. Kind of when your name gets plastered in the paper, it kind of paints you in that brush. So yeah, you've definitely got that. And then if you've had personally identifiable information kind of breached against your name, you look at Medibank and Optus and those kind of breaches that while they're a while ago, we're still talking about them. It's still attached to that brand. So you've definitely got that. And then you may find either in existing contracts or that you've got the clients or suppliers may just terminate to do any business with you because of that breach. So it's obviously another loss there. Um, the other part that you've got to look at is, I suppose, the staffing and your attrition rates. So that kind of big one there, over half of office workers reconsider working with a business that's recently experienced a cyber breach. I know it's one of those things where I take my personal information really seriously. I don't really want to be involved in something. So if my employer, not that I would say Rodin would, they look after it very well. But yeah, if there was an issue there, it would definitely kind of bring that front of mind for me. So yeah, I suppose there's some other research saying that 54% of office workers say that kind of a business compromise kind of influence the way that they would make their decisions of working with that company. And I suppose the other part of that is being breached is one thing, but keeping the workforce unaware of what's going on is the other part. So it is that transparency, and making sure that you kind of comply with what you need to around your notifiable data breaches and things like that to make sure that everyone who does or who needs to know does know. So whether that's clients or your staff as well. So with that, I'll pass you back over to Lee. He's going to run you through some of those responsibilities that I spoke about, and yeah, some of the best practices and cyber insurances that you can leverage.
Yeah, thanks for that, Brendan. That impact on reputation alone, it can't be overstated. Your clients, your employees, your business partners, today they will have clear expectations about the way you manage their information and data, and that standing that you takes many years to build up can really take a fraction of that time to fall apart. Um, I guess what I want to speak to now is a little bit around, there's quite a bit of change happening in terms of responsibility for directors under different types of legislation, and it's a space that's changing. So there's new legislation that's come out last year, some that's still under review by the government. So I'll go into some of the proposed and recent changes shortly. So obviously the Privacy Act has been around for some time. Obligations there, which include obligations to protect personal information and report security breaches, most notably under the notifiable data breach scheme, which requires organisations to promptly notify affected individuals and the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner about breaches that are likely to result in serious harm. There's penalties there for failing to report a breach that can be sort of 2.5 million for individuals or up to 50 million for companies, or 30% of turnover. So they were recently increased, 2022 now, following the Optus and Medibank breaches. And then we have the Cybersecurity Act. So in November, the Australian government announced the Cybersecurity Act 2024, which is some landmark legislation and a significant part of the government's 2023 to 2030 cybersecurity strategy, which is some measures that they're taking to, I guess, strengthen our national defences. So some of the changes that were introduced there were around mandatory ransomware reporting. So from May this year, businesses that meet the reporting threshold, they need to report cyber extortion payments, including the details of the incident, what was paid, communications, all those sorts of things. There's also introduced a centralised response to cyber incidents. So that formalises the role of the National Cybersecurity Coordinator as the coordinator of any significant cyber events, and also creates a process for voluntary information flow for incident coordination. There's also now a cyber incident review board. So basically it's an independent board, and the purpose of them is for conducting post-incident assessments of certain types of cyber events. They'll also be introducing mandatory standards for Internet of Things devices. So there's an implementation period there, but basically manufacturers and suppliers of consumer smart devices, which meet certain definitions, they'll need to be able to meet certain standards and have statements of compliance and those sorts of things. So it's not particularly onerous, that new legislation, but it's, I guess, a starting point that the government has indicated they're going to continue to build from. You'll also find that many of you will have other compliance requirements. So, those of you that are responsible entities under the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act, you have requirements around your risk management frameworks, reporting of incidents, or you may even find that kind of trickles down. If you're working with responsible entities, they may be asking you to demonstrate your risk management frameworks as part of sort of how they manage risk in their supply chain. And I know a lot of you are working with defence under the Defence Industry Security Program. So there's requirements across a few different domains, including cybersecurity and governance at the entry level. There's been some changes. So it used to be that you had to implement the top 4 of the Essential 8 to Maturity Level 2, but it's now they've changed that to Maturity Level 2 across the whole Essential 8. Across your entity's IT corporate systems. So that's something that will come up as your memberships go for renewal. And I mentioned there's also some change on the way. So the changes that are underway are, I guess, the principles for them that the government is working towards is around setting clear cybersecurity expectations. So things like standards and security minimums for businesses, increasing transparency. So, giving businesses and customers clear information about the security of technology products and services. Talk of maybe having a assessment following some sort of compliance standard. There's also principles around protecting consumer rights, so introducing appropriate legal remedies for victims. And the other big part is around some proposed changes to the Privacy Act. So the Attorney General's Department has recently reviewed the Privacy Act, and they put forward 116 proposals or recommendations that will be some of the most dramatic change to the Australian Privacy Act since the privacy principles came in. And some of those recommendations we spoke about came in last year. So there's been 38 agreed to by the government. So things like requiring that businesses take reasonable steps to protect the security of personal information. The OAIC also has been granted new powers to issue infringement notices, and also abilities for individuals to take legal action against organisations or individuals for serious invasions of privacy. There's also a further 68 that have been agreed to in principle. So things like removing the small business exemption and employee records exemption from the Privacy Act, having a 72-hour notification requirement in relation to the notifiable data breach scheme. So these have been agreed to in principle, but they still require a bit of further consideration before they'll come into law. I suppose the good news is that there is some really good guidance out there and best practice frameworks to help you all to develop an effective security strategy. And a lot of the things that these frameworks are talking about, for the most part, are pretty simple foundational things that you can do, and they make a big difference in terms of the risk reduction. It's just that the stuff that we were doing 5 years ago or even 3 years today doesn't quite hold up in today's environment. So the Australian government has the Essential 8, which is a set of cybersecurity strategies that were developed by the Australian Cybersecurity Centre to mitigate cyber threats. So I won't go into details of each of them today, but as you can see on the screen, they include some pretty common sense things like multi-factor authentication, patching software operating systems, application whitelisting, and certain specifications about the way they're implemented to avoid what can be less secure deployments, and also to aid checks and logging for if there's an investigation or an incident response. So the government's advice there through the Australian Signals Directorate is that they recommend all organisations adopt the Essential 8. And so these are the foundational things that are really good at preventing breaches. So the Essential 8, but then you also need to plan for what happens before and after a breach. So what we do before and after a breach, they're kind of often overlooked, but they are a really crucial part. And what you see on your screen here is called the NIST framework, and it's widely adopted internationally. It does a really good job of laying out on a page kind of all the components required for effective cyber risk management. So it aligns with the guidance being given by the Australian Signals Directorate. If you're doing DIS, but even your cyber insurers, they're all kind of telling you what they want you to do, and it's the same stuff. So you've got your things that are left of boom. So they're the things that happen prior to cyber attack. But obviously, if the boom happens, then it's also important that you have a plan for sort of what to do post breach. So that's when we talk about how do we actually detect if there's been a breach, but also how do we respond and recover. So on the left, we've got how do we identify our information assets, and then we put things like the Essential 8 in to protect them. But on the right, then we also have detect. So that's about how do we know if we've been breached? And you ask yourself, would you rather find out when your security monitoring and detection team notifies you, or when the business critical system has been locked up with ransomware? Obviously, two very different scenarios there. For most of you here, a managed detection and response service that continuously monitors and detects security events is really the most reliable way to be able to detect if there has actually been a security breach. And it's normally not something that your IT support company would do themselves, or your internal team, and should not be confused with the monitoring they may do to maintain your IT infrastructure. It's quite different and it's quite specialized, although very accessible. And then we've also got respond and recover. So these are the things that we do to respond when a breach has happened, and how do we respond and recover to business as usual. So one of the key components is having an up-to-date cyber response plan that will answer the questions you're going to have in a breach. Like, what do we do? Who do we need to notify? How do we notify them? And also testing that. And one of the things that I always say, actually borrowed from Brendan, is that when you're going through a breach, it's not the time to be figuring those things out. So while we're talking about incident response and recovery, we also often get asked a fair bit about where insurance fits. So cyber insurance itself is a pretty important tool in managing cyber risk. So as policies are going to help you with the cost of business interruption, recovery. They'll cover losses experienced that could be recovery costs, for the loss of damage to data, forensic investigation, remediation costs, and if you've got to engage PR, lawyers, those sorts of things from third parties. So they're going to help you to manage the consequences of a cyber attack, but it should also be considered along other risk management practices, and that's basically what cyber insurers are telling us these days. I'll talk about that in a moment. So things like the development of a greater cyber risk management strategy, the right controls, regular risk assessments, and should really be seen as kind of your last resort. So you definitely don't want to be testing the limits of that insurance policy. And they're not going to help you. Things they're not going to help you with are things like your loss of business, that reputation damage, whether that's the business itself or your own professional reputation, loss of market share, competitive position in the market, those sorts of things that Brendan touched on earlier. And there's also a fair bit of change that's going on through that space that's impacting business too. So as the number of attacks surge, so are the costs of premiums, the things they're excluding, and standards that have been set by insurers as well. So if you're an existing policyholder, you probably would have noticed that it's going up every year, and there's more stringent renewal conditions. And they're also, asking, they want to know more about what you've got in place, and they're kind of looking for the things that we see in the Essential Aid and NIST guidelines we spoke about. And exclusions as well. So, you really want to make sure that you're across the fine print. They're increasing, limiting, or excluding certain losses from cover, like ransomware, or some wordings will now limit cover for known vulnerabilities. So they could apply to a vulnerability where hardware or software has reached end of life, and there was a patch to fix it, but it wasn't applied. So you want to make sure that your IT is patching your systems, doing that vulnerability management to identify those things before it becomes a problem. And another thing to be aware of, finally on the note of insurance, is that the carriers will not pay out if you're misrepresenting on your renewal and application form. So it is crucial that you involve the right people when you're filling out an application. Make sure there are no misrepresentations. That could be something that's changed on your network, or understanding what security controls you actually have in place, making sure you haven't overlooked anything if you're filling them out on behalf of other departments or IT, as they could limit or deny coverage in that scenario. So lastly, we've obviously quickly covered off on the threat landscape, what's at stake, the essential strategies that you should be thinking about. But I would say the biggest threat to you all right now is complacency and inaction. And the best thing that you can do today is to start by being more informed about where your business stands in relation to those standards that we discussed today. Don't assume that IT has it covered for you. Now, what we do at Rodin every day is we take organisations just like yours through that journey towards cyber resilience. And often that journey starts with a risk assessment. So a risk assessment helps your organisation build an understanding of risk that's kind of objective and without bias, gives you the assurance that there are no gaps or mistakes that have been overlooked, and also helps you to support decision making around prioritising which risks to mitigate. So for any of you who are with us today, we will be sending out a resource that you can use to do your own self-assessment. That'll help give you a preliminary insight into your organisation's cyber maturity. And we're also able to provide you with a risk assessment as well, which will be performed by one of our experienced assessors at no cost. So we'll be in touch with a little bit more information about how to engage Rodin for that process. And I guess lastly, one of the things that we believe today is that modern businesses simply need a lot more, particularly in engineering and manufacturing firms, than a lot more than just general IT support and upkeep from their IT provider. So at Rodin, what we've done is we've redefined our managed IT services with a security first approach. So what we've done is we're integrating best practice cybersecurity and strategic enablement into the fabric of our managed service. So we can even complement your existing IT provider or your internal IT team with a managed cybersecurity services, which I guess enables them to focus on their core responsibilities while we handle the complexity of cybersecurity. We can provide alignment with best practice standards like Essential 8 and NIST as a managed service as well. So that kind of concludes the presentation for today. If you have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A. Obviously, we've got our contact details there as well. So if you want to catch up with us and ask any questions offline, then please feel free to do so. And it doesn't look like we've had anything come through at this stage. So we'll thank you all for joining us, and I hope you found the session useful.
That's all, guys. Enjoy the rest of your day.